Hello everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Jad. I'm going to talk about Z-index today. We're going to really take a deep dive into stacking order, so then we can talk about Z-index. But first, as I was already introduced, I'm a web performance consultant, independent. I work for myself. I've developed this learning platform, and one of the courses is Learn HTML/CSS.online, where I teach modern HTML/CSS. And in chapter 94, I had to talk about stacking context. And oh, it was a thing. It was like, took a week for me to properly understand. And it's okay, I just have to write it now. But yeah, I don't want people to hate me with this course. I really need to explain it in a way that is simple enough, but not oversimplifying to the point I'm teaching wrong things. And then this is where the idea came from that, okay, I need to give a talk about this because the stacking order algorithm hasn't changed, but there's been so many new things that have affected it. And that's what we're going to see today. For fun, I'm known by my friends as Jad of all trades because I do a lot of sports and I'm equally bad at all of them. I love snowboarding, very recent, longboarding, cycling, bouldering. So yeah, I'm really bad, but it's super fun. So you can follow me on Twitter, and if you love cats, you should follow my Instagram because I have my little cat. She's always there, travels with me. I didn't bring her today because she's just back from Italy, so she needs to recover from her flight. So in the talk today, we're going to talk about 4 more things. The stacking order, what is it, what's the algorithm? We're going to develop it throughout the talk. I'm going to talk a bit also about stacking context. Then we cover Z-index. I've got some props with me. Bought them from the action. They will prove to be helpful, I hope. And I'm going to end with recommendations because you're going to see that the concept can be quite very tricky, and it's really for browser engineers. I'm not a browser engineer, and it's we kind of don't want to really understand how it works because it's not going to be fun. So we're going to learn 80%, and then I'm going to give recommendations that help you avoid the last 20%. So what is the stacking order algorithm? Well, what is the stacking order? It's the algorithm that the browser decides which element shows up on which one, on top of which one. So if you have 2 elements, an H1 and a paragraph, they will be under each other. That's not a problem. But the moment you give margin top negative to this one, they will overlap. But will they overlap like this? Or like this? It starts simple, it gets more complicated, and that's what we're going to see. So as a bit of history, the algorithm itself, I think, hasn't changed over the years. It's still the same, and it's quite complicated. It's like 2-3 A4 pages, but this is meant for browser engineers. But why are we here? Why are we making this talk? Because there have been new properties that have been added. We now have flexbox and grid, and this even affects Z-index somehow. We have the new dialog element. Has anyone used the dialog element? Nice. And we have the popover attribute. That's very, very new. I think you haven't used it yet. So yeah, all of this affects the whole stacking context thing. So I know the code is probably not very readable at the end, so I'll always try and read it. But as a setup, we have 2 elements today, box 1 and box 2. All the codes will use this setup. Box 1, they're both 100 by 100 pixels. They have a different background colors, and one is pushed a little bit to the right or left. And I'm going to try and overlap them with different techniques so we can see which one goes on top of which one. These are the 2 boxes. Yeah, the code doesn't really matter, just 100 by 100. And the first example is where I'm going to overlap them by giving the box 2. So we have box 1, it's the same. In box 2, we give it a margin negative, so minus 40 pixels. So now I'm going to ask you if you think it's going to be box 1 on top, or if it's going to be box 2 on top. And please raise your hand. So who thinks it's going to be box 1 on top? Okay, and who thinks it's going to be box 2 on top? Okay, why?
It's rendered below.
There is online style, which comes after.
So it's a DOM order, yes. So here this is also correct, but so box 2 comes on top of box 1, and the reason you can think of it, this is painted first, and the second one is painted after, so it's going to be on top of it. DOM order is an important factor in the stacking order. It's also, it resolves the ties. So if the browser has two elements that have exactly the same situation, and they are in the same space also, stacking context, then the DOM order will be the last thing to decide which one goes on top. So it's quite important, but it's also the easier one. Now, let's get into more interesting stuff. I have the same code as before. So box 1 and box 2, and box 2 has a negative margin of minus 40 pixels, but box 1 now has opacity 0.9 or 0.9999. So who thinks box 1 will be on top? Who thinks box 2 will be on top? Great, you are all in the perfect talk today, because actually box 1 will be on top. And I know this is confusing, but it will not be after this talk. But it is really very confusing. Like, changing opacity affects which element is on top is something very weird, until you know how the browser works. So yeah, it turns out any opacity value less than 1 will create a stacking context. I will explain that in the next slide, but it really does. And I have this demo here to show you that. Yeah, that's going to be tricky to open the demo. Great. So this is the same code with the opacity things, but I just have over here box 1, hover, opacity 0.999. And you can see box 1 is below box 2, but I'm going to hover over it, and what's going to happen? It's going to go on top. If I release the mouse, it's going to go back. Yeah, it's really opacity less than 1 creates a stacking context, and we're going to see very soon. I see a lot of surprised faces. Great. That means, yeah, once we remove the mouse, there's no more stacking context, and they are reordered again.
Can we ask questions as you go through the
presentation? Yeah. I may tell you, though, the answer comes later, but tell me.
Okay. Is there a list of CSS properties that do this?
The answer comes later. Twice, actually, at 2 points. So yeah, what is a stacking context? You can think of a stacking context as a group of elements that is painted at once at the same time by the browser. I'm not a browser engineer, but I think this has been really created out of performance for the browser to really be able to paint all of these layers on the screen, know the stacking order. They had to be divided into stacking contexts. You can also think that if a change occurs in a stacking context, the browser can just update this, repaint it quickly. The browser can also use things like caching, and it's mostly an internal thing to browsers, but that we kind of have to know. It is part of the spec, so it's not too internal. It's not something in Chromium, but not in Gecko. It's something in all browsers alike. And today I'm going to make some analogy. It will seem weird at first, but I've heard feedback that it helped later. I will have folders, 3 folders, and I will have pages. So a stacking context will be compared to a folder, and it's on purpose folders because folders can contain other folders, which can in turn contain pages. And other elements, normal elements, so not stacking context, will be compared to pages. The colors don't matter so much, but yes. So let's see why. So yes, this is to answer your question. What creates a stacking context? Well, the first thing that creates a stacking context is the HTML element, and this creates the root stacking context. Even if you don't write the HTML element, so if you write a page that just says H1 and P, when you run it in the browser will create the DOM from it, and it will create the HTML element. So you will always have this, what we call root stacking context. I'll talk about it in the next slide. Transform properties, whenever you give a transform property with a value other than none, So transform, translate, transform, scale, skew, rotate. Or you can use the new translate, scale, and rotate properties. Has anyone used the new properties? Yeah, they're pretty cool. You can just say translate, 2 pixels, 5 pixels. You'll see them later in the slides. They have the same effect. They all create a stacking context. Did anyone ever have a z-index issue that kind of worked when you removed the transform or a scale? No? Or rotate?
Probably.
Maybe, yeah, okay. Opacity less than 1, we've seen it. And there's quite a lot more. I'm gonna show you some more common ones later in the talk. There's also a full list on MDN. We will revisit the full list towards the end of the talk. So the first thing I talked about was the root stacking context. This is something you always have. This is the biggest stacking context that contains all other elements and stacking contexts. So every page has it. So now, if we go back to the opacity example, we saw the element with opacity was on top. Well, let's see why. The stacking order algorithm is as following, but that's a very simplified version of it for now. From back to front, assuming that this is what you're seeing, so the front will be on top, you will first have elements outside of stacking context, so just normal pages, and on top of them will come stacking context. So if 2 elements overlap and one of them is an element, normal element, and the other one is a stacking context, the stacking context will show on top. That's though really assuming we're just talking about elements really next to each other, because you will see they have to be within the same stacking context, but I'll talk about this later on. So a stacking context shows up on top of other elements within the same stacking context. We'll get back to this. So yeah, I just made a folder analogy. And yeah, the reason why I have folders with me and the reason why I keep saying within the same stacking context, and also why this whole thing is complicated, is because stacking contexts can be nested. So one stacking context can create another one, can have another one, and can contain another one, and so on and so on. Now, I have actually one more question about z-index. Did you ever have a z-index issue where it only worked when you drag it in DevTools and throw it somewhere else? Yes, this has to do with stacking context. You will understand why it's the case. So, speaking about nested stacking contexts, how many can you find? I'm going to read the code because it might be unreadable. We have a main element, which has a translate of 5 pixels. Inside of it, there's a div with an opacity of 0.5. Inside of it, there's a paragraph. And there's another paragraph inside the main, but outside of the opacity.
Sorry?
Hands up for 1. Hands up for 2. Hands up for 3. Hands up for 4. Okay. The correct answer is 3. If you said 2, it's also correct, because it's a bit of a trick question, but don't forget about the root stacking context. So even if I didn't define it, there's the HTML element that's going to be created. So the root contains the one with the main because of the translate, and inside of it contains the one with the opacity, and the paragraph is just a normal element, same for the other paragraph. Now, stacking contexts flatten their children, and that's very, very essential. It's really very important. It means that if I have a stacking context and it has elements, normal elements, these elements are trapped here forever. They can be reshuffled, they can be reordered, like this can go below this one or the other way, but you cannot do this. So they always have to be inside. So if you have an element and you give it an opacity of 0.5, all the elements inside will remain always in this stacking order. There's really one tiny exception that I'll talk about at the end. So yeah, a paper cannot escape its subfolder. This is very important. And this is why you'll see later that the z-index order is only relevant when we open this folder. It's only relevant here, but outside of it, it doesn't really matter. If you have another stacking context, it has nothing to do with this order here. So if I come back again to the analogy, this is the root stacking context. It can have another stacking context inside of it, which also has some pages or some elements inside. But yeah, the order of these pages is only relevant here, because I could have another stacking context here, and there will be other elements here, but the order of these elements here has nothing to do with the order of the elements over there. So yeah, now we can talk about the z-index property. The z-index property allows us to control the stacking order of items, but this is really important, only within the same stacking context, so only within the same subfolder or the same folder. So if I go back to these again, I have, let's say, 2 elements. I have one stacking context. Inside of it, I have one blue element and one red element. I can use z-index with a negative value to place this below, or I can use a positive value to place it above. But this order is only relevant over here. Once you close that book, the order doesn't matter anywhere else, which also means that there's no z-index value that I can give that will allow me to escape this stacking context. But z-index is a little bit tricky. There's like 2 caveats, which is not all elements accept z-index. You can't say paragraph z-index 2. It's not about the element, but it's about the CSS. We'll see in a bit. And as I told you, you cannot escape a stacking context, even if you gave it a value of 214748367, which is like the maximum 32-bit integer. I do have a YouTube video on this. That's why I've memorized it. It's not for this talk. But which elements accept the z-index? Does anyone know?
Blocks.
Blocks? Block elements?
Block.
Yeah, but not just because they're block. You still need...
Do you want their tags or the
No,
descriptive?
yeah, maybe the word elements is not correct. Like if you have a div and you give it z-index 2, z-index has no effect.
Yeah, it needs to be
Box,
positioned.
It needs to be positioned, yes. So positioned, we call them positioned elements. This is any element that has a position property other than the default. The default is static. I think we never write position static, but this is position fixed, position relative, absolute, and sticky. For these ones, you can give z-index. And we usually, if you just want to use z-index, we usually do position relative z-index because that doesn't change the layout of the page. Are there any other elements? You cannot take a peek at my notes. So this is
There's something with flexbox, but I forget the exact.
that's good, yeah. Flex items, actually. So flex items take z-index without positioning. I have a demo for the next one. So if you have a flex box, so that's a flex container, and it has 3 flex items, you can just give the flex item z-index, and it will change ordering. This is very new, by the way. Even DevTools, Chrome DevTools gets it wrong. I don't know if I can show this, but do you know the third one? Yes, grid items, but not the container, grid items. I have a demo here, and I think I can show you the DevTools bug. Let's see. So I have a grid container, which has 2 grid items. Well, we still need to see the code. And yeah, it's only display grid, and I use grid column and grid row for both of them to overlap them. So now 2 is on top of 1. But you have to trust me, or I can show you that there's no position anywhere. I don't use the position keyword anywhere. But if I come over here, and I said z-index 1 on box 1, it goes on top of box 2. It's pretty cool. You can just use the index on grid items automatically. And the Chrome bug, if it's still there, the DevTools bug. It's fixed. Okay, this used to say here like the z-index has no effect over here, but it's fixed, so that's really good. I mean, I shouldn't have updated Chrome this morning. So how does z-index work? it allows you to reorder elements within the same subfolder. So yeah, I've said it 10 times, but it's really important. You can only reorder items within the same stacking context, within the same folder. There's no way you can escape it, except a tiny exception. And this is probably why you might have had z-index issues before, because it was in a different stacking context, or maybe it was there was an opacity, or there was a scale or transform, and this transform created a stacking context, and you were comparing it to another element that was in a different stacking context. So let's play another game. I'll read the code, but let's try and guess the order. We have a div with opacity 0.99, which contains the box 1, the usual box 1. And this one has position relative, so we can use the index, and it has a z-index of 21474836447. That's the maximum value. You can write 99999, but I think most browsers cap it at 32-bit signed integer. And then outside, we have box 2, which has margin top minus 40, so they overlap, and a scale of 1.01, so it has a scale value other than the default. It's a tricky one, by the way. So
Do we raise our hands?
I will give you 5 seconds. Okay, so who thinks box 1 on top? Okay, who thinks box 2 on top? Okay, why?
I'm looking at the scale. So you have the order of elements, like rendering order, and then both of them have opacity and scale, so that applies stacking order. And inside the first, you have an element that doesn't move outside of the element, like you explained with the folders.
Yeah.
So that's why I think the second box is on the top.
Yeah, that's correct. You have, I'll just do the folder analogy. This is the opacity 0.99, which has an element. Technically, this is also stacking context because it has position relative. And it has the highest z-index, great, but it just only means it's really at the top of this folder, and that's it. And then we have another element which also creates a stacking context. And what's the tiebreaker here? It's going to be the DOM order, and then it goes on top. It is annoying, to be honest. Like it's not fun to kind of have to worry with these things when you're working as a developer. But this one, yeah, maybe is a bit more frequent than. Well, no, actually, this is the example where I would say you might have used the index and it didn't work. And the problem in that case would be the opacity 0.99. What's the solution? Of course, depends on your project. But if possible, to remove the box 1 out of the opacity 0.99. Or to apply this z-index at a higher level. And yes.
So scale also makes a stacking context?
Yes.
Yeah.
Any transform value other than... There's a lot more properties, but you can kind of guess these are the ones, in my opinion, that have to run on the GPU more or less. Like I'll get back to it in a bit. So yeah, 2 shows up on top. So as we've talked, the common reason why the index may not be working is probably because they are in different stacking contexts. You can quickly try by removing that element in DevTools, placing it somewhere else, and seeing if it works. The thing is that we all think about the index as this number that is absolute, that works for all of our app, but it actually doesn't work like this. It's only relevant within its context, its folder. Now, there's more. It's not over, because we talked that stacking contexts flatten their children. We said that once the elements are within that folder, they cannot escape. We can rearrange them internally. But I'll show you after I talk about the stacking order that this could actually be a good thing. You know, it's kind of like a folder that you, we worry about the order over here. We close that folder and then we throw it away. We don't have to worry about it anymore. I'll show an example in, I think, 2 slides. So what's the updated stacking order? This is a lot more correct than we've seen before. This is with the index. From the back, we have positioned elements, so elements that have a position, like a relative, absolute, or elements that accept the index. So, and their children, because everything gets flattened. So if you give a massive div a position relative, the index -5, all of its children will be flattened, and they will be placed at the back. Okay, this is because they have a negative z-index. Then we have non-positioned elements. So this is most of your code, the majority of your code. This is normal h1 and normal div, normal p. Then afterwards we have elements that create a stacking context, but not z-index. It's really annoying. So this is opacity, transform, scale, and these kind of things. And then on top comes the element with a z-index that is positive. It's again really annoying. Like, I remember this when I give a talk, but if you ask me about this next week, I'm not gonna remember it. It's very specific. And that's kind of a simplification of the real 3-pager browser algorithm. But this is why I'm gonna have recommendations on how to not have to worry about this as much as possible. But I want to talk about one more thing, which is flattening elements. What if you want to explicitly flatten an element? What if, for some reason that I'm going to talk about, you want to say, yeah, I want to put all of this in some kind of folder and throw it away? Like, maybe you would think, give it opacity 0.999 and give as many nines so it doesn't look like an opacity, but that's a hack. If you give it a transform, that's also a hack because it has consequences for the GPU. So there's a property that has been for many years supported on all browsers. That's the isolation property. If you give isolation isolate, that's gonna create a stacking context, but only a stacking context. So it doesn't have a visual effect. It may have a visual effect, but it's not like the opacity, it's not like the transform. So when would that be useful? There's more or less 2 use cases. The first one is a component that uses z-index. I'll show you the next slide, an example. And another example is, let's say you're using React or Angular or Vue, and you're rendering this massive application inside of your root element. And of course, you use z-index a lot in this root element. But then later, you decide you want to show something on top of that app, and it's placed outside of the root. You can seal this whole root. You can just close everything and forget about the values of the index you've used by making it isolation isolate. And then afterwards, you can use z-index 1, z-index 2. Let me show you an example that will make it clearer. Let's say we have a component that has position relative that uses z-index. So it uses z-index 1, 2, 3. You can seal this component by giving it isolation isolate, and now it's in a folder. So the value of 1, 2, 3 is not relevant anymore outside of it. That means outside of it, if you use a z-index of 1, it will come on top, but it will not go in between that component. And this is the power of it. To be honest, I've never had to use it, but in a very massive project, it could have its benefits. Does anyone have questions on this?
It's supported in all browsers?
Yeah, for a very long time, actually. It can also be used with one of these like blend mode, background blend mode. It could have really different visual effects, but because it creates a stacking context, but I've also not used it there.
Is this something you should use as a standard for each component that you make if you want to isolate it? Or could it have some weird effects to use that? For example, if you have a very componentized front end with React components,
Yeah.
should you use it for each component as a standard?
I want to say yes, but we are always riddled with exceptions. So if for some reason you want kind of one element out of that component to be on top of something from another stacking context, then this will not be a good thing.
Yeah, for example, a pop-up or something.
Yeah, well, I have a solution for these ones, but if you have something that is really sealed and can be sealed from the exterior, like let's say, a small animation that uses z-index, you can just, and you don't want it to show, you don't want anything to interfere with it, then I would give this one isolation isolate. It's in a folder, it's there, and nothing will come in between. And then you can position it as an element back and forth. It's also a bit like the layers in Photoshop. Yeah.
I have a question. There is a property which is called display contents.
Yeah.
Which actually removes diff from the DOM. And in case if you're gonna have the isolation or any other property which makes it foldable, will it affect it or not?
I'm not sure. It's a very interesting question. Maybe we should try it afterwards. But so you mean, Well, the thing is, it doesn't really remove it from the DOM. It's more removed it from the accessibility tree, and it's also not considered a direct descendant anymore for algorithms like flex items and grid items, right?
Yeah, and then it's more like it makes this kind of transparent for engine, because then you can do viewer stuff with all the child elements inside of it.
Yeah. I'm not sure how that would affect the stacking context. I would assume, just an assumption, that it would still create a stacking context.
Because, for example, you can operate with the order property, and then it will take effect if you have like a flex inside of the flex items. So, for example, have the flex box outside, then the display content can be
Inside, yeah.
for the mobile, for example, but for the desktop it's gonna be flex, and then they have the flex items inside of it. If you're gonna be contents, then it will take their parent.
Parent, yeah.
Yeah.
But where do you want to add isolation isolate?
On their second.
On the one that has display contents. Yeah, let's try it after the talk. I would assume it still creates a stacking context, but it's also not easy to visualize if it's a stacking context or not. There are Chrome extensions and Firefox extensions that I talk about. So if we go back to the question of what creates a stacking context, again, it's the HTML element, transform values, opacity less than 1, position absolute or relative, when there's a z index other than auto, position fixed or sticky, and sticky even has some like asterisks for mobile versus desktop. And there's a few more, like the will change property used to promote an element onto a different layer, mix blend mode, filter. So that's why I tell you everything that's really rendered on the GPU, but it's not really officially like that. There's a few more. You can find the full list on MDN, and somebody tagged me on Twitter, and from then with a question, and then I realized container queries. Have you ever used container queries?
Applied to the media container? Media queries.
Yeah, but for a certain container. Apparently, these also create a stacking context. Someone stumbled upon it. It's still not on MDN yet. I'm not going to click on the link. Maybe they updated it. And but yeah, so there's quite a lot, but it's not your typical properties that you use for most other elements. So yeah, this is for debugging stacking context. Please make sure not to use Chromium's layers tab if you've ever used the layers, because this is internal to Chromium. It doesn't always map one-to-one with stacking context. It may for small examples, but these are internal layers and it's not really the same. There's Microsoft Edge 3D view if you want. For larger pages, it's going to be quite a mess, but for a few demos, it's kind of nice. You can do it on pen and paper if it's for like a certain small section. And there's even extensions for Chrome or Firefox called CSS Stacking Context Inspector. So it's really quite a lot. We've covered 80%. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question about the previous slide. I remember Firefox had before the Quantum update its own visualizer of z-index, and it was pretty advanced, more advanced than what I remember
3D view.
Edge's 3D view to provide. Which one is, in your experience, the most complete? Which one's the most usable?
Oh, I would.
Out of the options that exist right now.
I would try and not have to use any of these if possible, because you know what I mean? It's like I would rather not have to deal with these edge cases, because if I have to and I fix the solution, I'm gonna break it again. And this also comes from me fixing. Also in my app, I have quite a lot of z-index issues, and I'll fix it. It's working, and then I break it on mobile. I fix it on mobile, and I break it on desktop. So in my experience, I try to avoid them as much as possible. This might make sense more when I give the recommendations. I haven't used the one from Firefox. I have tried the one from Edge, but just for this talk, so not more. So yeah, we've covered 80%. The last 20% is even way more tricky, and that's why I want to give you some recommendations, so you don't have to deal with those last 20%. So these recommendations play well together. You don't have to use all of them, but if you do, you will notice some benefits. And the first one is to have a sensible DOM order. And that means if you have an app and you want to show a dialog, if you want to show this first time tutorial, you know, that shows up on top of everything, don't place it at the beginning of the body, but place it at the end of the body because that's easier to place on top of other things. But when applying this, please make sure to never break the accessibility tree. This should be your first priority and then z-index. So if you have a header on top of other things, do not place the header at the bottom. That's really bad, and I don't want to be the reason why this is happening. So always prioritize the accessibility tree. But for dialogues, for first-time tutorials, tooltips, it makes sense to actually throw these at the end of the body. Actually, many UI libraries do that because then it's easier to, they are not in a stacking context because they are at the top level of the DOM. So then z-index will just work and go on top of everything else. Yes, so this kind of lets you use z-index sparingly. So the point is also to try and not have way too many z-indexes floating around. This is how you make it easier for yourself. Now, as developer, I told you we all think that we have this kind of a global layer. Like if I use the index in this component, I just have to compare it to that other component, but that's not how it works because it's only within a stacking context. But you can create your own global layer, more or less, at the top of the DOM, at the root of the DOM. If you keep all of the elements of your UI, the major elements like the navbar, the floating action button, the dialogs and all of these things as high up the DOM tree as possible, so not nested. And if they are in the same stacking context, you can then give them z-index 10, 20, 30, 40, and it works as possible. I know this is easier said than done when you have frameworks, other complications, also accessibility to deal with. But this is an example, more or less, if you have like the floating action button really nested all the way, and if you have the modal also nested and the sidebar, this is going to be quite tricky to work with z-index because later down the line, maybe we want to animate the app. And if we animate the app, we add opacity, and that's going to create stacking context, or transform, and then suddenly all the z-index is messed up. So if possible, you can keep the content, the app, the container, and move these elements that in this case don't break accessibility to the end, because then you can give the content, the floating action button, the sidebar, and the modal. You can treat them as a global layer. You can say z-index 10, 20, 30, 40, and they will work. As your code gets more complicated, this also gets, of course, more complicated. So you maybe even want to have like some comments explaining like this is here because of that, and yeah, also communicate with the rest of the team. The third tip is to build or use a UI kit. So you either use one, then they take care of most things, like many, like the MWC, the material web components. If you open a dialog, they inject it at the bottom of the body. Then it always works, and they give it the maximum z-index, I think. So many of these libraries have already thought about it, and then that's why it just works. Or create your own UI components, and you can also isolate them with isolation isolate. Probably, just like he asked, not all of them, but whenever you think a component should not interfere with the outside world. And the last recommendation, where we're actually going to learn a lot from this recommendation, is I've said dialogs before, but if you have a dialog, you maybe want to use the dialog element because it's pretty cool. It's now supported on all browsers, and it is rendered in the top layer. And the top layer is something that really shows up on top of everything, I promise. So you have all of your page, all of these z-indexes, all of the mess, and then you have the top layer, which is managed by the browser. And there's a dialog element, but only in modal mode. I'll show you the difference. That is rendered on the top layer. But this also means that the dialog element can escape any stacking context. So even if it's nested within 25 folders, and you open a modal from there, it actually escapes the stacking context because it's rendered in the top layer. And this is something we never had before. It was completely impossible to escape a stacking context. And this is the only way to escape stacking context. But there are other things that allow you to render on the top layer. So we have two demos here. The first one is a non-modal dialog. So it's a normal dialog. This is the H1. There's a button that opens it, and there's the dialog. The dialog by default is hidden. And I just have an H2 here, And I have a form with a method dialog. I don't know if you've seen that, but that's an easy way to close the dialog. You submit the form into the dialog. This is pretty new. So, and the JavaScript is just adding an event listener on the button. It selects the dialog and it calls the show method. The show will open the dialog in non-modal mode. What does that mean? It means it will open the dialog, but the rest of the page is still, you can still interact with it. It doesn't trap focus. So look, if I press tab, I can still click on the open dialog. If I press tab again, done. So this is not like the model where you have to choose one of the two options or options. This is not rendered on the top layer, and this you can change the Z index. But if I go and change this to show model, or if I go to the other code pen, so it's the same code, except that it now says model mode. But instead of show, we have show modal. And look at the difference here. Open dialog. It's now in modal mode. You can see this backdrop, this gray effect here. But if I press tab, I cannot tab into other elements. If I have like 4 buttons in the modal, you can tab between them, but the focus is trapped. I don't know if you ever had to deal with focus trap in dialogs. It's very important for accessibility. Otherwise, your users are like tabbing through 25 links and they can only like select 2, actually. Did I? Oh yeah, I wrote a space. So, but now let's see how this works behind the scenes in the browser. Open dialog, inspect. So this is the dialog. It's rendered on the top layer. You actually see the top layer in DevTools. So if I click on it, it takes me to the top layer. Where is the top layer? It's really on top of the entire page. You see HTML, top layer. And this is where the dialog is rendered. It's pretty nice. But that also means that if I take this button here and I give it position fixed, Z index, what was the number? 2? Oh yeah, let's go with the German 9999. It cannot show on top. It's really not possible. Yeah, it's now behind the dialog because this is running on the top layer. One other thing is you can customize the backdrop with the backdrop pseudo selector. So do background color red. You can actually do opacity 0.5 and it will not affect the dialog. That's, I think I was wishing for that for 12 years. It's pretty cool. I think browser support is pretty good, but just in case, dialog, you may, but it's still a recently shipped element, I think from last year for all browsers, so you may want to test more than usually on browsers. Yeah, it's supported on all browsers. Yeah, I think we don't say except IE anymore, right?
Can you open multiple dialogs at the same time?
Very good question. It's on the next slide, but yes, the one that comes after renders on top of the other one. But again, hopefully you don't have to deal with order in the top layer because then, but maybe you do, and then it's just the order of the elements you open and close. The last one is going to be on top.
So you cannot change it with
No.
that index.
No, yeah. So one more slide about the top layer, and that's it. Elements that render on the top layer can break free from any stacking context. There's no exception to that, and no matter how nested to it. But it's the only way to escape a stacking context. At the moment, there's 3 things that render on the top layer. There's the modal dialogs, so dialogs with the show modal. Popover elements, I'm not going to talk about them because they recently shipped in Safari. I think they are more or less ready in Chrome, but probably not there on Firefox. But it's a way to make a popover. You know these first-time tutorials? It's the hardest thing on the planet to build for us. Because how am I going to fix the Z index, the positioning? But you can now make this escape the stacking context and show on top with a popover element, with a popover attribute, which you can add to any element, and the full screen API. So if you have a video and you say request full screen on that video with JavaScript, it's going to render on the top layer. But to go back to your question, yeah, you can actually request full screen on a video and then open a dialog on top of that. And because the dialog comes after the video in the top layer, it will show on top of the video. So you can even build UIs on the top layer. So yeah, it's...
I see where to use it. advertisement on top of videos.
Ooh. We will do another voiceover on top of that.
YouTube, don't hear us.
Crypto mining. Crypto mining on the top layer. Ah, that's my next talk for next year. I think there might even be more ways in the future to render on the top layer. I remember seeing something, but it's early in development. So thank you. You can ask me any questions, and I hope you enjoyed this.